Hi, and welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today, John Euler and Ed Sparrius sit down one more time for part 2, all about a new book that's out and a study that encompasses a lot of factors of the LGBT community. 78 individuals, ex-LGBT members, and they use that member word quite a bit, which again kind of comes back to that cult scenario. We're going to break it down. There's a lot to unpack in part 2. If you didn't see part 1, we do recommend you go back and take a quick look. We'll be back with more from John and Ed right after this. ExposingSoji123.com provides all the info you'll need to protect your children and family from this transgender ideology. ExposingSoji123.com has done all the work for you, extensively researched and well written by a concerned father, Pierre Barnes, who's been researching for the past 3 years, providing this invaluable information in this time of great need. With dozens of letters pre-written to every official you can think of within your province, the documents provided are fill in the blank so you can amend and send. It's that simple. Plus, while you're visiting the ExposingSoji123.com website, you'll also find info on teachers' misconduct cases related to sexual abuse in your local area, and the pornographic books that you've been hearing so much about in your local school libraries. Make your voice heard and count for the children to the highest levels of provincial and so-called federal political leaders, health ministers, school board officials, and more. ExposingSoji123.com, where the facts are real. Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm Brad Wilder. Today, John and Ed continue the discussion for part 2, the Free to Change study. 78 individuals who are ex-LGBT community members have all left the community. Now, they were asked some very specific questions. They provided some very specific answers with specific details about not only their lifestyle, but their future as well. With that, let's bring in John and Ed. You guys covered a lot in part 1. What's part 2 going to get into, John?
Brad, we're going to look at, again, the implications of when, quote-unquote, anti-conversion therapy laws are passed. We're going to look at what happens, the real-world implications. Australia is living through it, New Zealand, Canada. Brad, you all are living through that. It's coming down into the U.S., and people need to awaken. It's in Scotland, I believe. It's all throughout the Western world, right? This juggernaut is coming through like a tsunami, and it has in its sights, ultimately, the overriding of parental rights. And once these individuals, and I call them those that are the pushers of the trans deception, those that are pushing this, have designs on getting a hold of kids to unduly influence them. And really behind the scenes, and Ed, you have seen this, and this was part of then the study that you put together, that once these kids are influenced, they may at some point in time begin to rethink and want to reconsider, and then those that have unduly influenced them don't like that. And so they found the pushers of this ruse. It's really a delusion if you tell someone they could be born in the wrong body, but they're easily exploited. They're easily manipulated, groomed and manipulated, then exploited for cash or for sexual profits, so to speak, meaning preying upon a kid. And so these young people are being harmed, both minors that are going into the trans movement and then when they become adults. And so the concern is, have these kids been unduly influenced? And when and if they begin to reconsider, are they free to change? Are they free to be able to seek out those that could help them sit down and explore? And especially as mandated reporters, we better be free to explore, because if you don't explore the 9 red flag clinical indicators of sexual abuse, then all you've done is you're a predator's best friend. You've just done the don't ask, don't tell. Dean. So, Ed, you really you helped spearhead a study that is one of a kind, because as you were telling us in part one of this, as we were getting ready to close, that if ever there's been a study, and this was a very scientific study, both qualitative and quantitative analysis, and here is the study. Let me see if they glare, right? Free to Change study, a survey of, that's right, how many? Sorry, 78 people that ended up, they were in the alternative lifestyle, and they decided that it wasn't for them. And it's a very extensive study, and I was very privileged to be a part of writing one of the chapters. There's multiple chapters, and you were just sharing with us that this has been under massive scrutiny. And what's beautiful about this, and the reason it was provided, is legislation was being rammed through one of the houses of parliament in Australia, where you are from. And there was a study from La Trobe University. It was the only thing being passed around as far as trying to validate the reality that the legislation, anti-conversion therapy legislation, needs to be considered and passed. And you felt compelled with others to say, wait a second, there's another side to this. So you put together an extensive study, and people around the world now can download this and take it to their own lawmakers, can take it to school board members, that this is a bona fide study showing that there are benefits from allowing people to be free to choose the therapist of their own choosing, and they should be able to be free to change if they so desire. Welcome back.
Thanks very much, John. Happy to be here. Yeah, look, isn't that a human right where, you want to be able to seek your own happiness? And if your own happiness happens to mean that you no longer want to be part of the LGBT community, shouldn't you have that right to leave that community? But more than that, actually look for help. Because most people, when they want to change their life, need assistance of some sort, whether that's from family, whether that's from religious leaders, whether that's from counsellors. Most people will go looking for some sort of assistance from somewhere. And in Australia, as in Canada and New Zealand now, that cannot happen. Anyone who helps you faces the courts, and that's just an abuse of human rights that's so egregious. How on earth our politicians ever went along with this and passed these laws is beyond us. We just do not understand how that is a possibility.
Gender dysphoria is a condition where a person's physical, biological sex is one, say a boy, but in the person's mind they think they're really a girl, or vice versa. It's not something that you can identify on any objective test. You can't do a blood test, for example. You can't do MRI imaging. You can't do genetic testing to actually find this gender identity. My name is Dr. Michael Laidlaw. I'm an endocrinologist in Rockland, California. This gender identity, which is really a child saying, I believe I'm this, I believe I'm a boy, I believe I'm a girl, something opposite of their body. Once they say that, they go down this road of gender affirmative therapy. That consists of social transition, wearing, say, stereotypical clothes of the opposite sex to pretend that they're the opposite sex, then these puberty blockers, then these cross-sex hormones, and then finally surgical modifications to the body to try to make the person appear that they're the opposite sex.
Good professionals all around the world are starting to raise serious questions about what they've seen in terms of unethical professionals taking advantage of kids that are gender confused and have serious untreated mental health issues.
With this, I can see no need to take these medications. I see the risks as being very high, and I see children as a very vulnerable population, can't speak up for themselves, and their parents are often propagandized by this movement. I've met a lot of these parents. My heart goes out to them. I've seen their kids and pictures of their kids, and really, it's about helping kids.
But after 24 years working with the Tavistock, Dr. Bell, a former president of the British Psychoanalytic Society, has recently retired. And in his first television interview since then, he began by outlining his worries about the service.
In the beginning of the gender service, when there was only about 50 people, 60 people coming, the majority desisted. That is, they gave up the idea. They came off the puberty blockers. Now 99.8%, or 99% persist. And the judges suggested that one of the reasons, a major reason for this persistence, is that the prescription of the puberty blockers and the changed cultural context may act to reinforce this view of themselves. Whereas given time to think may open other possibilities.
Because I feel like by encouraging minors to say, like, I'm in the wrong body, we're starting with a harmful mentality that's not going to go anywhere good.
A record number of young people are being referred to the Children's Gender Service at the Tavistock. There were just 77 patients referred here 10 years ago. By last year, the number had climbed to 2,590 children, the majority female at birth. And they've told us around 3,000 more children are on the waiting list. The clinic sees children under 18, some as young as 3 years old. Around half the children who come here are put on drugs at puberty to essentially pause their physical development. That would be the first step of any medical intervention.
Unfortunately, many of our professional organizations are advocating for this, including Endocrine Society. And it's important to bear in mind that there's very small groups of people controlling these societies. Small groups of people are making these pronouncements.
Not long after my report came out, the chief executive made a public statement in which he said that those who raise criticisms against the trust have an unfortunate attitude to gender. Now, I don't know what unfortunate attitude to gender means, but I think this is like a message to everyone else who doesn't have my seniority and my safety, really. Oh my God, I better not speak out because they'll think I'm transphobic. Leaders of movements with a very powerful ideological commitment have managed to capture policy, both medically, professionally, in the media, and in government.
And then when physicians want to turn to what's the best practice, they're finding these things. And there's no rigorous research done. There's no controlled studies. It's very poor research, but it's, I guess, politically correct to go down these roads by these organizations.
With no evidence base, it's a purely highly politicized movement, which has had these consequences. So all that I am saying, and many people are saying, is that they need to wait. There needs to be a thoughtful engagement with them, as opposed to motoring them through to treatment pathways which have irreversible consequences for their bodies. So we're talking about not doing harm.
Maybe this is just me. But I mean, of course, hindsight, because back when I wanted to take hormones, I thought Planned Parenthood, oh my God, this is like a godsend. I don't have to go, because I didn't want to talk to a therapist. So I don't have to jump through any hoops. I don't have to do anything. I just walked in and got it. And yes, that's on me for not knowing what I wanted to do. But I also feel like if it wasn't just as easy as just walking in and signing a form for something that permanently changes your body for essentially the rest of your life in some aspects, I think, like, if it wouldn't have been so easy for me to just walk in, I don't think I probably would have transitioned, because I think the longer I would have thought about it and given it more time to think and given it more consideration, I think it may have played a part and may have influenced me transitioning at all. If it just wasn't so easy just to willy-nilly on impulse just go and decide to take hormones.
Puberty blockers are powerful hormones. They act on a small gland in the brain called the pituitary, and this controls the sex organs. For example, these blockers stop this action. Once you stop it, there are various harms and problems that occur afterwards.
The next would be hormone treatment at 16 years old, and any surgical procedures would only happen after they turned 18. Sky News research suggests 35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Gender Service in London in the last 3 years. We've managed to contact 20 of them. Only 6 would speak to us. All 6 said they were concerned about giving hormone treatment to children with gender dysphoria. All 6 felt they weren't able to properly explore underlying psychological factors.
Looking back, there are young people who I now wouldn't necessarily put on medication or sign off on medication.
This was the only clinician prepared to be interviewed. They asked us to change their voice.
I was once working with an executive that felt the gender dysphoria a young person was presenting with was really strong, really intense. So she decided to put the young person forward for the hormone blocking treatment after 2 appointments. Looking back, it was a young person with a history of trauma and direct trauma in terms of abuse. And also there were other things happening to them, and this was not really explored by the clinician.
These views were echoed by others who had worked at the clinic. Therapy is not an option in this service, one psychologist told us. We fear that we have had front row seats to a medical scandal, said another. The whistleblower says they saw many female-born patients with underlying issues, such as experiences of homophobia or even a history of abuse.
The numbers started growing from 2012, when we started seeing more females coming forward, and this has happened across the Western world.
And as a psychologist, did you ever feel that you could say to a parent, "I don't believe your child is trans"?
No, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave the service, because as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
Doctors will feel compelled to follow what their organization says without really looking into the evidence necessarily. There is heavy-duty propaganda basically going on, but these gender clinics have sprung up and have multiplied all across the country. The numbers are going up around the world, in the UK, Canada, here, other places. More and more kids are being diagnosed with this, and there's a social contagion component. Kids going on to YouTube, Tumblr, things like that. So the cases are rising. It's a major problem that we have to address.
It became very confusing.
And it was very confusing because my mother was forcing me to be ultra feminine, and there was no praise or emphasis on physical strength anymore. It was all about just being pretty.
Okay, so from a tomboy, you wanted to then almost be a boy.
Yeah, well, I got 2 younger brothers, and I was always envious of them and the way my mother let them do whatever they wanted. So that just got in my head that, this is a thing you can do, it's really easy, you can just change gender, it's no worries. I was totally lied to, even by doctors. I was sold this thing that isn't possible.
You used a lot of online stuff, right? YouTube and all sorts of things. How much of an influence do you think, though, online material, the online community is, for kids who may be suffering gender dysphoria?
Oh, absolutely. I think social media is the ideal modern day PsyOps platform more than anything. I mean, if you want to push any agenda, that's the way to do it.
With no evidence base, it's a purely highly politicized movement, which has had these consequences. So all that I am saying, and many people are saying, is that they need to wait. There needs to be a thoughtful engagement with them, as opposed to motoring them through to treatment pathways which have irreversible consequences for their bodies. So we're talking about not doing harm.
My name is Chloe Cole, and I was allowed to transition at 12 years old. I believe that children deserve better than having their momentary feelings dictate how the rest of their life plays out. I was 13 when I began taking puberty blockers and testosterone, and I was 15 when I underwent the double mastectomy and I had my breasts surgically removed.
You were 15 when you had the operation?
Yes.
Since we're talking about young people that are being impacted by this medically, the medicalization of kids, again, would you repeat for us, as former head of president of the American College of Pediatrics, you've been a physician, a pediatrician for years, that if you medicalize kids, if you give them puberty blockers, you are going to be damaging them significantly. Is that an understatement?
Absolutely. Yes, you absolutely. Puberty is not a disease. Puberty is a critical time of development physically, emotionally, cognitively, and spiritually. It is a critical time of maturation. And we are robbing children of this critical, normal period of development. Therefore, they cannot help but be damaged. It is true. And we know for a fact that puberty blockers can predispose to new mental illness, that package insert says It leads to anxiety. It exacerbates labile emotions. We have demonstrated already in studies that these children do not develop their normal bone density. And we know from what Lupron does as a side effect in men and women that it impairs memory. And there's at least one case study of a little boy who did lose many IQ points. This is a horrible, horrible criminal experiment on our children. And what makes it criminal is that when you combine the puberty blockers with cross-sex hormones, you are sterilizing them. And as I said before, that's not healthful or caring. It's an atrocity. It's eugenics.
Before you had the operation, did you think of yourself as a girl or a boy?
I didn't really have any doubts about being a girl up until I was maybe about 11 or 12. But it wasn't until I was introduced to the transgender community online that I actually started to think of myself as a boy.
So you were having enormous self-image problems.
Right. One of the mantras of the transgender community is that trans men are men and trans women are women. And in my heart, I really believed that I was a boy.
So you thought, get it done now, get it done early.
Right. I mean, the idea is kind of that the younger you transition, the better, because the less secondary sex characteristics pop up during puberty. And so the less gender dysphoria you'll experience.
Let's start with, what are your concerns? Where do you see the dangers that come from this, that stem from this? So talk to us about your concerns because there's a lot, and we're going to get into some of the myths, especially the dangers, the medicalization. That's a huge part of this. You cannot separate how kids are being medicalized, and that's part of what concerns us. So talk to us about your concerns.
Right. Well, my concern to begin with, or one of the most fundamental parts of my concern, is having been a registered nurse for over 30 years and coming from a family with a few doctors in it, that there's no scientific basis for the initial diagnosis. I mean, we started off with gender dysphoria. Now that's a description of a feeling. But then we have transgenderism, which is a description of an entity, and that entity does not exist. Nobody is born trans. People make themselves trans through surgery. But there is no innate biological condition of transgenderism. And that's what this is all being sold on the basis of, that there's some innate condition called trans or transgenderism, but there is not a scrap of evidence that that condition exists. So we're starting off on a false basis. And in science, if you start off on a false basis, you're going to get bad results. And that's what's happening. So we're starting off with that terrible basis, a lie, a huge, huge lie that's gone around the world, as you say, and has taken in so many young, vulnerable people and their parents and doctors and health professionals and therapists as well, who, like you said, they should know better. They don't have an excuse as far as I'm concerned. The children have an excuse, of course, because they're being exploited. And the parents also, they're being not just exploited and conned, but threatened that if they don't go along with this, terrible consequences will ensue. So my concern is that we're doing horrific harm to young people on the basis of a complete myth. I would call it science fiction. We're doing horrific harm. We're taking healthy bodies and damaging them irreparably and irreversibly. And we're also taking healthy minds and damaging them, again, irreversibly. And yes, there's no excuse for it.
The crazy thing in Australia is, particularly in the transgender movement, you can change your sexual orientation every 12 months. So today I could say I'm male. Tomorrow I could, in 12 months' time, I could come back and say, well, actual fact, no, I'm female. And I can get psychologists that will help me to transition into becoming a woman. If 12 months later I decide, well, actually, no, I am really a male, I can get no assistance to go back. That change I've made, whether it's drugs, whether it's surgery, whatever it might be, social, I cannot go and ask for help to go back to being a male. Now, where is the sense, where's the freedom, where's my rights as a human being to seek my own happiness in that area when legislation says no one can help me? I find that an absolute crime to humanity to be doing this. and we're doing this to kids.
And this really speaks to part of the huge concern about what's being called conversion therapy and therefore anti-conversion therapy laws in this sense. First of all, they capture the language, those you've referenced, very cult-like. I concur on part one, that the trans movement will suck these kids in. It's recruitment and retention to get them on the moving sidewalk of the trans movement, which will sterilize and then eventually amputate as it dumps them out onto a surgeon's gurney. So the cults and cult leaders and manipulators push, they will all play with language. Because if you can play with language, you play with the conceptual ideas of what people understand. So if you call it conversion therapy, it seems like we are, somebody that is practicing that. I don't know anybody that practices conversion therapy because we're not out to change anybody into our image, so to speak. But the trans cult, as it divides and separates families, they will draw that child in, and as it were, they will take possession. They draw it into the community, into the family, into the movement, and they, in essence, hold a hand up and say, parents, keep your hands off our child. If anybody tries to then, in a way, if the child comes out of the cult leaders, those in the trans movement, say, somebody has converted our child. So this term, it's such a slick flipping of the script.
I am the thunder.
Mel Jeffries is a brave woman. She's admitting to one of the biggest mistakes she's ever made, trying to become a man. She's now detransitioning back to the sex she was born as. But she'll forever carry the physical and emotional scars of her decision.
There ain't no stopping me now.
If you're meeting someone and you're telling them about your journey, how do you describe it?
A cluster. It feels like that's the most appropriate term, but it's like a lot.
It's not.
We'll just say it's a lot.
You're being a bit hard on yourself.
I've gone through a lot.
Born a girl, Mel grew into an unhappy teenager. She suffered from depression and confusion about her sexuality and began to believe her life would be better if she transitioned. How did that begin?
Probably like through puberty. I had like quite a few experiences that were negative. Like I was sexually assaulted. And I feel like that was quite a big fuel for me wanting to transition and not be a woman anymore.
Because you felt what being a woman was making you vulnerable?
More vulnerable and like an easy target. I thought that I was safer within like a male identity.
So you thought changing genders would solve that, would provide a degree of protection?
That's not like, that's part of like the magical thinking that I had at that time, where it was like, I could be someone completely different and I wouldn't have to be me. Like I wouldn't have to deal with everything that came along in my life. Maybe all my unhappiness is because I was born in the wrong, sex.
And those answers now, in hindsight, were a mistake.
Yeah, they didn't. They left me worse off.
So I think the conversion therapy issue is just a massive red herring. It's just had far too much press. And the conversion therapy is actually gender affirmation, because the gender affirmation people are saying there's only one way. If the child says they're trans, well, then they're trans, and you have to do everything you can to transition them before they've had any opportunity to think it through. That's conversion therapy, not the open-ended exploratory psychotherapy, pardon me, and family therapy that responsible therapists are undertaking to help the young person and the family explore, the issues as to how this young person has come to the point in their lives such that they feel that they're transgender. And we have to remember time and place. This is a feature of the youth of this generation. It has never been a feature of the youth of any previous generation, to my knowledge. And so we have to assign a very important role to social contagion. And the way that the lobby has ingratiated itself so successfully into all our public institutions.
What would be the message that you have for parents as far as the dangers of the trans movement and all of this kind of bundled up together? What would you want them to know?
The most straightforward thing to know is there is always a more honest answer to gender-confused kids than chemical sterilization and surgical mutilation of healthy young bodies. I can't put it much more simple than that. There's other things to know about, the problem of gender dysphoria, transgenderism. Decades of studies showing the overwhelming probability of underlying mental health problems, adverse childhood experiences, dysfunctional families, and an unusually high percentage of autism spectrum disorder. And it's those underlying issues that should be dealt with, not experimental, not proven safe, not proven effective gender transition procedures.
Oh, yeah.
Again, the mental health problems underlie it in the first place. We have 4 or 5 great studies out of the US, out of Western Europe, out of Australia, that show that the problems predate any identification with gender dysphoria. So they were there first, not the other way around. What's happening is they're being decoyed into thinking they have to go through gender transition procedures, be it social, puberty blocker, cross-sex hormone, or even surgery, in order to be put straight. And that is certainly not the case. And if any access to proper care is being restricted, it's the restriction against being able to get the mental health evaluation and support that they need.
So how many hours, minutes, days did it take before from the time you went to the doctor?
What do you mean with how long did it take to get diagnosed? Like under an hour.
Under an hour?
Yeah. Because I was primed with if you don't transition, you're gonna die, you're gonna kill yourself. All my hatred of being a woman was just focused on my chest, on my breasts.
At 26, Mel had a double mastectomy. But instead of the happiness she sought, she was left with a pervading sense of loss.
After the operation, Mel, was there a light bulb moment? What made you want to be a woman again?
I don't know if it's light bulb, but it's I heard I was called Mason, and that literally just it just felt so foreign and alien. And then it's just why is it hearing that name just feels so disorienting for me?
Kids who are being dragged in this transgender movement at the moment, and many of them by the age of 25 have discovered, and the studies vary somewhat, but somewhere between 70 to 95% of kids, and the reason I say it's that range is because the study is not totally fixed, but certainly somewhere in that range of kids turn around as young adults and decide, yes, I'm in actual fact the gender I was born. I am actually a male physiologically, I'm a male psychologically, and that's what I want to be. These kids can't get help. They're stuck.
Before I went home, and for about a week, I wasn't able to take off the medical binder or the bandages or anything like that, because I just for the integrity of the stitches and the grafts. But once I did, it was a little horrific. I didn't quite regret it yet. It took a little bit for the regret to set in. The whole thing was a lie. The very premise of it was a lie. The further I went into it, the more my body masculinized, and especially once my breasts were gone. With each step, it made me more conscious of the fact that no matter what parts of my body I was rid of, no matter what was taken from me, I would always be a woman.
There's a lot of conflicting information within gender healthcare. One thing that I was told directly by the doctor, and the surgeon, Dr. Roth, had actually privately called my parents and had conversation with them, telling us both separately that it's best for me to do this as young as possible, so that way I recover better and I'll heal better and I'll look better. The procedure was 7 hours, and immediately I woke up. I could not walk for the entire duration I was in the hospital. I had severe pain all over my body. I actually had an epidural in because of the pain. I could not use the restroom. And just a few days later, I had blood clots in my legs. I had a DVT.
What's a DVT?
It's a deep vein thrombosis. It's a large clot that was in my leg. And they only discovered it because I had a fever. So from there, I had to be on blood thinners for 3 months, and I had to do injections every day. And immediately from there, nothing was recovering. It got worse over time. Immediately going home, this is not typical, and they told me this wouldn't happen, but during a procedure like this, they completely shorten your urethra because obviously you don't have a penis anymore. So they have to cut it and put it like right at the body. And mine was so swollen that I had a catheter in for about a month attached to a bag. And I could feel it like every second. And you also have to dilate when you have this procedure. So basically, they're essentially like plastic, like large, almost like toys.
Yeah.
Very similar to that. And you have to put them in and leave them in for 30 minutes at a time.
With that pain.
And it felt like a knife inside of me. But I was terrified to like not miss a second, because then I would feel like all of this was going to waste. And I would lose everything that I thought I had wanted for so long. But every single day, the pain was worse and the bleeding was worse. I would bleed all over the bed every time I would do it. And I knew even just a month, 2 months in, something was really wrong. The way dilation works is they give you 4 different sizes, and you are supposed to work up to the largest. But I was going backwards. I would try so hard. The surgeon told me, oh, like you just have to make it fit. You just have to put it in. And I couldn't. I felt like I was being shredded inside. And I had no idea what was happening. I would try and call the doctor. I would say, this feels wrong. Like, there's just no way that this is what it's supposed to be like. It looked horrific on the outside. Like, I mean, it didn't, and it still doesn't really look like any kind of genital. It looks like something in between. And I remember that even from when I had the surgery. It looked horrible on the outside. And everything felt wrong in my body. And I would try and call for help. And he said, oh, it's just normal. Try using more lube. Take deep breaths. Try a different angle, like using a pillow. And it made no difference. Like, and I was constantly being told that. And even when we went in for checkups, he just kept saying things were fine. He was like, oh, things are fine. My mom would be there. He was like, oh, this is fine. And I would ask questions. I'm like, what about this pain? Like, I'm still bleeding. Like, I'm still having like discharge coming out. Like, I'm still in so much pain. Like, even 2 months later, I would walk and it would feel like there was a brick right here. Like, it was just nonstop pain. And he said, oh, it's fine. It'll go away. And then just a few months later, I got to a point where I called him and I said, this pain is not going away. It's getting worse by the day. When I try and dilate, I feel like I'm ripping myself apart. And he said, just take antibiotics for 2 weeks. And I never had an infection. It wasn't until the end of that year that I finally called and I said, I need to come in. Like, there's something so wrong here. And I don't understand why no one's actually had me come in and really look. They finally had me come in. They did an ultrasound and it's called a vaginoscopy. It's where they go in and look. And there was no infection. What was happening was I had scar tissue all internally from the new organ, and it was collapsing and causing my pelvic floor trauma. And he told me, there's no recovering this. Like, there's just no way. Like, your body's completely rejecting it. And so he said, you can just stop dilating. Like, it's going to close up either way. And he said that there was just really no other way to fix it beside another surgery. And I cried. And I cried in that room because I fought for this to work. And when it didn't, that was the reason I never finished school, because I was recovering that whole year. I thought that all the pain that I had been through and I put my family through was for nothing. And I cried in that room. And all he said was, I'll give you a minute. He came back in and he told me, well, we'll have to do it again. And this time we're going to have to use a graft from the colon. So we're going to have to do it that way. He sent me to another specialist pretty much just a few months later, because in order to do that surgery, you have to have a colorectal specialist who takes the graft. I met with him and he said, there's no way I will do this to you. He said, your pelvic floor is so traumatized in these MRIs that it will be severely worse complications if it happens again, or you could lose your life. Took a lot from myself and my family. I believe upwards of maybe $170,000. And a lot of the money that I had saved, it was pretty much drained from this. I pretty much had to start over. My mental health was destroyed. I couldn't finish school because I was so behind, so I didn't. I didn't know. It made me question who I was really supposed to be, the life I was supposed to have, because everything that I had been told for the last almost 10 years was not true. And so now I'm stuck, and I have all these feelings about wanting to have a family, wanting to like be in a relationship, wanting to have those experiences that other people have. And I don't even know how to feel that because I have none of those feelings. Even in that area, it's very numb. It doesn't even look like an actual genital. It looks in between. And every day when you look at it, it's just painful. And I don't know how I'm supposed to ever have those experiences that other people have, because I decided so young to give it up.
And they have a lifetime now of living, either being sterile, being sexually incompetent, having constant infections if they've had surgeries, and they cannot, and obviously the anxiety and the depression, they can't get help for this in Australia, in our states. And how can lawmakers justify doing this to our children? It is just unbelievable. And that's the same in Canada. And apparently in the USA, they're trying to do the same thing there.
I masked a lot of what I was really feeling. And I used being trans as a way to deal with all of the things that I was feeling. Looking back, hindsight is 2020. Of course, I wish someone would have said to me, stop. Which of course, I was a child, and I could have, things could have ended up differently if, but there's no point in saying what if. I was also very obsessed, I was obsessive. And I feel like there were many red flags.
There were all these red flags, and I honestly wish that somebody had pointed them out to me, and then I might not have transitioned in the first place. if I had realized that, somebody with a history of an eating disorder, a history of childhood sexual abuse, a history of, neglect and bullying for being a gender non-conforming female, a person with internalized homophobia and misogyny should not have been encouraged to transition, as if these things could be solved by becoming a man. And I wish that somebody had sort of tried to stop me.
By putting on that pathway, it rather becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
After that, I was like, okay, maybe I'm non-binary, and then I thought more about it, and I obsessed over it for months, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm trans. I think that I'm a trans guy. And when I thought that, I physically felt a weight lift off my shoulders.
The children have been diagnosed now as their main problem being gender. The other problems are left aside. And this results, in my view, in many children having inappropriate medical treatment. Children of that age, say 10, 12, 13, 14, can they really, and given that they're very disturbed at the time, are they really in a position to to weigh up and understand what the implications for them are?
And I would remind your viewers, the UK, Sweden, Finland did comprehensive literature reviews, and those are rare things that cause them to do a 180. They're not doing this gender-affirming care as a first-line thing anymore. They are strongly emphasizing psychological evaluation and support for both the child and family. And the reason is clear, as we previously stated, there are going to be underlying mental health problems, family dynamic problems, adverse childhood experiences, even in the best of homes. That's what these kids need to have made available. But I'm quite confident that the majority of the mental health professionals in the West are afraid of being accused of conversion therapy if they try to deal with underlying mental health problems.
So your contention is that's the actual conversion therapy?
Yeah. And one of the biggest things that frustrated me is that, to me, it's obvious that gender-affirming care is conversion therapy, and it's condemned widely by all the medical organizations, but gender-affirming care is endorsed by those same medical organizations. And the thing that really struck me as ironic is that conversion therapy used to use chemical and surgical castration. And who's recommending chemical and surgical castration now? It's the gender-affirming care people. And so I took a deeper dive into the aspects of conversion therapy, and almost every single aspect of conversion therapy matches up with gender-affirming care. You talk about conversion therapy being torture, cruel, and inhumane, and contrary to human rights. Well, what they do to these children is absolutely cruel. They tell them that in order to be their true selves, they have to medicate themselves and mutilate themselves. That's a cruel statement to make to anyone, let alone a child. Gender-affirming care is inhumane. It takes someone who's physically healthy and turns them into a lifelong patient that will require hormones and occasional surgeries throughout their life. But basically, there's all sorts of issues when you put people on puberty blockers and you put them on cross-sex or wrong-sex hormones. And they're finding more and more evidence. First of all, transgender patients live about 10 years shorter than a non-transgender patient. They're more prone to cancers, heart attacks, osteoporosis, all sorts of different issues. If they've had surgery, they're prone to infections because those are not natural structures. They're not reconstructing natural things. They're constructing false things to look like the opposite sex. And there's all sorts of problems with those. In fact, one of the people in the initial Dutch studies, a kid, died because they were trying to put part of the colon to make what's called a neovagina. And he died from sepsis following that surgery. It's harmful all around.
That should have been enough to stop the trials right then.
It should have. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's murder. If you want to really, I mean,
this is just, it's Nazi-like medical experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. And several of the gender specialists overseas have made that same comment. It's experimentation. But the Americans say, oh no, it's widely accepted and it's standard of care.
You have called the trans movement the greatest medical scandal that has swept into not just youth culture, but into countries around the world. We touched on it in part one. Let's again talk about your concerns. And this is so important for parents and others to understand. So speak to why you use those terms. Those are very powerful terms when you say it's the greatest medical scandal of our century.
Yeah, well, I think, we could possibly compare it to lobotomies that were one of the great medical scandals of last century. I'm not being sensationalist when I compare the medical intervention of what's going on with children who are undergoing the euphemistically expressed phrase gender affirmation, where they're having their puberty stopped, where they're being pumped full of a cross-sex hormone that their body is not geared to tolerate. And then, very sadly, many of them are undergoing particular forms of mutilating surgery, the most common of which is the double mastectomy. But we've also got the genital surgeries, the phalloplasties and the vaginoplasties and the sigmoidectomies and so forth, where young people are turning up 2 and 3 years later to the surgeon saying, I made a mistake, I want my penis back, or I've made a mistake, I want my breasts back. So these children clearly haven't understood the irreversibility of the procedures to which these doctors think that they've consented, because, going back and asking for a reversal is absolute evidence that they did not have any understanding of what they were doing at the time. And so there's two things. I mean, obviously, do no harm. And secondly, to make these kinds of decisions at a very young stage of the lifespan is utterly and unforgivably irresponsible. And yet surgeons are making a specialty of what they call, sex reassignment surgery or gender affirmation surgery. And they're advertising and boasting about how many they've performed in a particular period of time. And I think one particular surgeon who is now recommending caution about surgeries for young people declaring themselves transgender has performed 2,000 of these surgeries before realising that it's a very bad thing to do. But I've never seen her once apologise to those 2,000 young people whose lives she has irreparably destroyed by her technical skill as a surgeon in removing their genitalia.
In terms of people understanding your situation, do you believe that your predicament of deciding whether or not transitioning was right for you was about the process that got you into it, or was it that you had to change after transition?
I think it really came from the fact that since I transitioned so young, I grew up and I matured a bit more. And I really thought about my future in ways that I was just not capable of at the time of the medical interventions. I thought about do I want biological children? And I kind of had an oh shoot moment because I realized what could have been done there and that I could have really damaged that chance, along with just like I said, really just getting older and growing up a little bit more and being able to actually process what these feelings were and where they originally came from, and like deal with stuff like my dysphoria and my depression and any other issues I had in a more mature way that in the long term I think will be better.
Your parents, speaking as a parent, they were very much, tell me if this is true, encouraged by the clinician that, hey, if you want to help your kid, you need to get down this road as far as you can, as fast as you can. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, they were told the fairly common line that I feel like parents hear now, that do you want a dead daughter or a living son? Pretty much like, well, here's the path we have laid out. If we don't follow it, there's a very good chance that your child will commit suicide, despite the fact that I did maintain throughout the entire thing that I was never suicidal. They still were pushed to believe that.
What do you think that was about?
I like to think that there is like a genuine sense of care in wanting to protect kids from being suicidal and like protect them from themselves if they are suicidal. But this can't be the right way to funnel kids that are like confused with their body or their gender down a course where, at least in my case, it very quickly turned to medical intervention.
And how can lawmakers justify doing this to our children? It is just unbelievable. And that's the same in Canada. And apparently in the USA, they're trying to do the same thing there.
Right, they've coined a phrase, anti-conversion therapy. So they captured, their masters, those that are manipulative, those that want to exploit people are masters at capturing the language. So they were brilliant to come up with a phrase, anti-conversion therapy. So what I say is, like, a therapist wants to convert anyone, number one. But that really took hold. It has a religious feel to it, right? The term has a religious connotation. Well, who would want anybody to be converted like that? And then it's based upon these personal stories that can never be, or I've never seen any or heard any that truly are, that provide proof to these different stories we hear, that a parent was told by a kid or a teen that he was really gay and the parents didn't want it. So the parents took him off to some so-called professional that's going to hook him up to electrodes and do ice baths and, really subject him to aversive therapy. So that's, we hear all those stories and we're supposed to believe that, yet they can't provide proof of who those so-called therapists were or religious leaders. The question is, where are the lawsuits, number one? Because it is illegal. You mentioned that. That is absolutely true, right? That's violating somebody's rights. And I'm wholeheartedly in favor of, if somebody was subjected to torture, then they need to go and sue or press criminal charges. So where are those suits? We don't hear that. But isn't it interesting that those same people that are pushing this narrative that now has changed laws, which this study helps provide proof that people should be able to be free to change, and they are, and there's beneficial outcomes when they make decisions in their best interest, when they're given that information. But those that are saying that conversion therapy happens and that anybody that's going to, any professional or pastor or possibly parent, but as we talked about, this is aimed at primarily mental health professionals and then also pastors, that if a mental health professional or pastor is working with someone, helping them process their emotions, and there may be trauma, there are indications of sexual abuse, and through that processing, the person decides that they don't want to continue into an alternative lifestyle. They want to come back. They want to go back to a different way of being. That's called conversion therapy. So those pushers of that concept are fine when they hold stories up saying this is what conversion therapy does, but they won't listen to the lived experiences of those that were saying or are saying. And on Reddit, there's a group, and there's a detransition group on Reddit that has 50,000 people that have regrets.
Yeah.
So we have to say they were unduly influenced. And it is, how can, that's what you were just saying, Ed, how can anyone in good conscience, once they start seeing those numbers, ignore that right now 50,000 young people are saying that they were either fast-tracked, unduly influenced, or weren't given the help to process their own emotions and feelings. And if they had been, maybe they wouldn't have decided to undergo life-altering, life-changing, unnecessary surgery.
I was 16 when I started testosterone. And if I had been forced to wait, I thought that being trans was like making me want to like kill myself. But if I had been going to a good therapist, if I had been going to school, if I had had friends and had meaningful relationships with people outside of the internet, I know that I would have been able to reconcile my female identity with myself the way that I was. I was just living so like disconnected from my body and so disconnected from who I really was.
And look, as a parent, and I've had 5 kids, not unusual to have a little kid turn around and say, "Oh, look, Dad, I really think I'm a girl," or I want to put a dress on. And as a parent, you set a gender example for them, and you would say, "Oh, that's all very nice, but we're guys, we don't do that. We wear pants or whatever else, whether it's playing with dolls or however you want to excuse somebody's having the wrong gender." I mean, a child only at a kindergarten the boy needs to start playing with dolls, and the kindergarten teachers here already have red flags up, or maybe he's transgender, as though playing with dolls makes him the opposite sex. But you set gender examples for them. Boys are naturally more rambunctious. Whereas girls are more affectionate, having I've raised a number of kids, and it's their different sexes is very obvious. You might have girls that are a little bit more masculine, boys that are a little bit more feminine. That's just a normal mix in society. But the thing that I found interesting in the study as it came in, and it's the same for both groups, whether we're talking sexual orientation or gender identity. There seems to be a standard where you've got a very sensitive child who has very bad gender modeling, whether there's an emotionally or actually absent same-sex parent often, or an over-emotional opposite-sex parent. These kids then have trouble relating to their own sex. No, I hate using the word to their own gender because it's been so abused. But you might have a boy who doesn't really get along with other boys, so he spends more time with girls. And then down the track, this child, and that's often because they haven't had that gender modeling. They really don't know how to relate to their own sex and the other sex because they haven't got mum and dad showing them that. And then down the track, invariably, because of their behaviour, they become targets for predators who then sexually abuse these kids. And then you get to the next stage where the predators will introduce them to pornography. And these kids are on this track that they just can't get off. Interestingly enough, society is trying to tell us, and has been now for quite some years, probably since the 80s, your sexual orientation and gender identity is a genetic thing. A couple of years ago, there was a very big study of almost 500,000 people. So we're not talking a small number to prove and find the gay gene. In the end, what they concluded was that nurture, a person's environment, is what hugely affects to their sexual orientation and gender identity. And their conclusion about nature or genetics was there are indications that this could be caused. In other words, we have absolutely no proof, but we don't want to admit that our study failed to find what we were looking for. And so where people are trying to say, well, this is innate, there is absolutely no evidence for that at all. So when you have groups of people who have been in the gay lifestyle or in the transgender lifestyle, and they turn around and they change their lives, they are proving this is not something that's genetic. And you'll often hear them saying, hear people in the gay community saying, I knew this from a child. Well, what child knows they're sexually attracted to someone else? They may enjoy the company of people of the same sex. It doesn't mean they're sexually attracted to them. This is something that comes down the track. Again, often when these kids get sexually abused, that's when all the lights get turned on and they suddenly start wondering where they actually stand. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. You're the one who's been counselling these people.
And you're exactly. And what we find time and time again is there's trauma. There's trauma in the background. And so if you cannot allow for these young people, so we'll kind of focus now on the trans movement for a moment, because really that's what this kind of legislation is really targeted at, right? It's not so much people that are adults that are deciding to change their mind. They really want to prevent middle to late teens from being able to sit down and figure out, where did this come from? Where did this confusion come from? Where do these ideations come from? So if you tell therapists that if a child who now is in a alternative lifestyle, a minor, so that's very interesting. The question is, how did the minor get into that? Usually unduly influenced and groomed through pornography. So there's probably somebody older in their life that's been taking advantage, right? You can sexually exploit someone without the victim knowing they're being sexually exploited. Think about all cults, right? Cult members are being used by the cult leader for the cult leader's benefit, but the cult members will never describe themselves as being used. So you can play a mind game on somebody. And you reference cult. This has all the earmarks of a cult, right? There's certain methods, there's certain ways of recruitment.
Exactly. It's very cult-like. And even when you listen to adult detransitioners, people who transitioned in adulthood, they were susceptible to these same cult-like techniques. They fell into a group of people who believed in transgenderism, and their partner might have said, hey, I think you've got gender issues. Then they see a therapist and the therapist says, oh, how long have you been dressing like a man? You know, this is what they said to Scott Nugent, who's very well worth listening to. He was 46. But if you go back to children, we're looking at this indoctrination, and that's the only word for it, starting from preschool or even earlier. Because everywhere you go now, there's the rainbow flag, and there are constant, you know, we're barraged with messages about pride and trans, and, you know, it's never ending. But children are starting on this track very, very early. They're being told from the earliest ages that they can change gender, that they might be a different gender, that if they're not stereotypically female to the point of being like Barbie, which later on, when they get a bit older, turns into a porn version of Barbie. If you're not like that, then you're not really a girl. And if you're not like G.I. Joe, and they're telling them this from very early ages, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, then you're not really a boy. So you're being told from a very early age that your body is wrong. Now, what a horrifying and terrifying message for a child. You know, children's imaginations are so vivid, and they're terrified of something happening to their body. So to tell them that their body is wrong and their body's even dangerous and their body's going to do terrible things if it's left to its own devices, that's a very cult-like message. And it's absolutely horrifying that children are being exposed to this by teachers. And then, should they end up in the clutches of a therapist, unfortunately, the vast majority of therapists are going along with this stuff, as are the vast majority of the medical institutions, the medical organizations. It has affected every area of society. Every institution, virtually every single institution, is now captured by this mythology, this science fiction. And yes, so it's like a kind of societal cult.
I'm just not doing great. I wish this never happened to me. Like, I was an extremely mentally ill child. I can't believe my therapist lied. I can't believe my doctors didn't care about all of the self-harm and the suicide attempts, and like the same hospital that was putting me on, or the like clinic, that was giving me testosterone was also giving me stitches for cutting and stuff. And then my therapist was like, oh yeah, all this behavior ceased when he found out that he was trans and started aligning himself that way. And it just wasn't true. Like, I was still cutting, I was still suicidal, and they let me do all of this, like, you know?
And so the social influences and the social contagion that draw people to a particular point of view in the way that cults do and in the way that this transgender cult has done over the past few years is much more successful at recruiting participants than people who have tried to extract that group of people from the cult.
Trans movement offers the perfect opportunity for sophisticated predators to utilize the best of time-tested cult techniques of targeting, of recruitment, and retention, like you will find in some of the more notorious cults, such as the sex cult NXIVM and Scientology. And the one thing about a cult is once it has you, once it's lured you in, it doesn't really let you go very easily. Not without a fight.
Lollipops and all free today. Cherry pies, cream puffs, ice cream, treacle tarts.
Treacle tarts and ice cream and all free.
Come along, Kitty Winky. Come along, my little dears, my little mice. Come to me. What will it be? Ice cream?
Yes, ice cream!
Strawberry, chocolate? It's all inside. Come along, my little dears. Go inside, what a baby. Go inside, my little dears.
Last thing I remember, I was running for the door. I had to find a passage back to the place I was before. Welcome to the Hotel California. Such a lovely place, such a lovely place, such a lovely face.
So what is the trans movement? Well, in a nutshell, it's a phenomenon that's sweeping the Western world based upon the premise that kids can be born in the wrong body. There are fraudulent groups, organizations, and deceivers who suggest that administering cross-sex hormones can help facilitate a child changing into the opposite sex. That's a grand deception, and it's only gaining momentum. What I can assure you is that, clinically speaking, this phenomenon didn't exist prior to the year 2005. There are exceptions, there have been throughout human history, but never was there anything like this seen by myself, my colleagues, people I knew working with very difficult cases with kids in the system. This didn't exist.
And you can mostly only do that one at a time with painstaking therapy, which does take time and effort. And that's why we're playing a very difficult catch-up game, because we're trying to combat a propaganda, a terrible propaganda that's been perpetrated in every corner of social existence. And trying to undo that with a handful of people around the world is proving to be very challenging.
And I was told that all of my problems would go away if I transitioned, and that all of my problems were because I transitioned. Like, I was anxious because I was, all of my problems were because I was trans and born in the wrong body. Like, I was anxious all the time, and I had social anxiety, and I didn't get along with people because I was born in the wrong body. Like, I really believed it. I really, really believed I was born in the wrong body. Like, I was so convinced. And And so I destroyed everything about it, and about myself. I mean, even the whole dead name concept, you know, like, wow, it's like a death, you know, it really is. I feel like I killed myself. I feel like I killed a child. That was me. I just hope this never happens to anyone else. I'm getting a lot of hate for what I'm doing, but I'm talking to a lot of people too. I'm hoping that I can make a difference, but yeah, I can't sleep. I don't want to see my doctors, not that my referrals are going through. I honestly just feel like getting on one of those hormone websites and ordering estrogen, because my identification and stuff still says male, so I could easily just lie because they just give it to you so easily. And like, I know that's mental illness talking, because I'm splitting on doctors, and I know it's not healthy to self-medicate, but like, I feel hopeless. I don't feel cared about. Like, my doctor doesn't even know what's going on. And no one cares. Like, I mean, I guess some people care. That's not true. That's black and white thinking too. There are people who care, but nobody with power and authority cares. None of the doctors care because they're making money, I guess. I just want my life back. Like, my whole life is about this. My whole life is about this. Like, I literally ruined my life as a teenager. And
that's what's happening with these kids. And that's why the pushers of this don't want kids to be able to sit down, minors to be able to sit down with therapists that are going to be able to explore. So number one, that means they're never going to sit down with a therapist that, as a mandated reporter, is going to be able to spot and meaningfully interpret the red flag indicators of sexual abuse. And as therapists are being trained now anyways, that all these indicators reflect that this kid is trans. When in fact, very few abuse victims, especially minors, are ever going to come out and disclose immediately that they're being perped on. They're going to first exhibit symptoms: depression, anxiety, panic attacks, compulsive behaviors, self-injurious behaviors. That's what is going to bring them into counseling initially. The question is, where is that coming from? So if you tell a therapist that any of that may lead a child, a minor, to no longer want to go into the trans lifestyle, you can lose your license, you can be fined, you can be jailed. And that's where this study, now trying to educate lawmakers, comes in, and so invaluable. So people now have access to a bona fide, rigorous study that they can download. They can go to the site, again, freetochange.org. Ed, and the site is there. And Ed, you referenced that on the site as well, especially CAUSE, Coalition Against Unsafe Sexual Education. Diana Kenny has a number of videos permitted that. We ourselves on Unmasking the Trans Movement interviewed her about how this is the world's greatest scam. And I had first become aware of Dr. Kenny from an interview she did, and I thought I would play it for us because she is being asked to address this issue of affirmation therapy, that we're going to just affirm. That simply means this: if a troubled child comes down, comes to your office, comes in to seek help and says, "I'm beginning to wonder, right? I don't feel like I'm born. I feel like I'm born in the wrong body." All the things that we know that these trans kids are being told and affirmed. So unless you say yes to them and give them a referral off to the gender clinic, which is now going to medicalize and sterilize and amputate body parts, then you're being accused of conversion therapy. And what we will hear from Diana Kenny in this, and we will also see detransitioners' responses, which is really comes down to this. Why wouldn't you want a young person to be able to adequately explore to see if this is the right decision for them? So let's play. This comes from a video that I had put together, really the first one regarding the trans issue, called Understanding the Trans Movement. And we are going to hear from Diana Kenny on the program, The Bolt Report.
The Australian Psychological Association, that represents psychologists, it is now written to the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute saying, and get this, doctors should be able to perform irreversible surgery on children under 18 to change their gender, even when the child's parents say no. Now, the association says that as long as a doctor thinks that a child can make that decision for themselves, they can get that surgery. And what's more, that association says, well, don't worry about giving the child mandatory counselling before the surgery. Scrap it. It's just an unnecessary burden.
What's happening is I took testosterone on and off because I was so dysfunctional. But I took testosterone for a few years, and I had 2 botched surgeries on my chest. And immediately after the second one, the denial that I had been in for the last few years just fell apart, and I was faced with the fact that I was living a lie and that I just couldn't do it anymore. But at that point, nobody was talking about detransition, and I was alone with this problem, and I just started using drugs and ran away from everyone that I knew.
Well, Professor Diana Kenny is a developmental psychologist, and she deals with many parents whose children have declared themselves transgender, born in the wrong body, so it's said. Professor Kenny joins me now. Great to see you. Thank you so much for your time. Can you tell me, Professor, what you make of this recommendation that doctors should be able to perform this gender-changing surgery even without the parents' permission?
Well, obviously I'm dismayed and disappointed that the peak body for Australian psychologists could make such an ill-considered statement that would result in quite young children, often very immature, often with psychological disturbance, making such decisions for themselves without proper oversight. It's very disturbing.
I don't know if it was actual dysphoria. Some of it, maybe it was. I still kind of feel it sometimes, but a lot of what drove me to transition in the first place was linked to a lot of mental health issues and a lot of stuff that I had going on that really should have been taken care of beforehand, but it was not for a variety of reasons.
Can we ever really say, as the association seems to suggest, that a child under 16 is capable of making a decision like this, can be mature enough?
I was younger, especially when I was a teenager, 16, 17 years old, I struggled a lot with depression. And I won't lie, at certain points in my life, and I'm not going to go into detail, but at certain points of my life, I was suicidal. Because circumstances, like I said, I won't get into it, but certain points got really rough, and I hit some major lows, and sometimes it got really, really hard to see around the corners and picture the next day,
Look, 16-year-olds vary vastly with respect to their maturity and their intelligence and their capacity to analyse very complex situations. But what we do know about this subpopulation of young people with gender dysphoria is that many of them, actually almost a majority of them, have other mental health issues.
I soon ended up going to a children's mental hospital in my state because I was so depressed that I wasn't going to school and my parents didn't know what to do. So they sent me to the mental hospital for about 10 days and that didn't help. I think I was at the point where it actually kind of made it worse. And I started pretty soon after that, when I came back, I was still cutting myself and still depressed. It didn't do anything. I still wasn't going to school.
And many come, with a background of serious psychological issues, such as being on the autism spectrum disorder.
There are so many overlapping or interlacing conditions that can be confused for gender, like for a need to transition, or can cause dysphoria, and going through the massive list that nobody ever really went over with me as a kid.
Suffering quite severe depression, anxiety, social isolation, marginalisation, and so on. And they're struggling very hard to deal with these underlying issues.
Something I did as a reaction to what was going on around me, with my toxic relationship. I hate using that word, but that's really what it was. And like my really difficult home life and my struggles with school and my struggles with severe anxiety and depression and, autism, blah, blah, blah. The list goes fucking on and on. And it was just like the only way that I could express what was going on inside of me.
And then to be given the freedom to make decisions about irreversible, life-changing surgery that could seriously impact the quality of their life from that point onwards.
Now, most insurances that cover top surgery require some kind of official letter from one or multiple therapists or like gender therapists or doctors or medical professionals stating that you are a person that experiences gender dysphoria to the extent that surgery is necessary. I got really lucky, and the therapist that I found only required one therapy session in order for her to be comfortable writing this letter for me.
Diagnosed when you were younger, like by an actual clinician, or how did you come to accept that you were transgender in your mind?
Well, as a child, I never got diagnosed by any clinic, and not until I went out on my own at age 18, 19 when I did it on my own. The clinic that I had gone to around 18, 19, well, 18 is when I started to go. The therapist that I got, she actually told me that she could get me all the paperwork that I needed to transition that after my first session with her.
So are you suggesting that they've got other things going on in their lives? They think their problem is that they're born in the wrong body, so to speak, and surgery will fix it, when in fact they've got these other things that surgery will not touch.
Absolutely.
So I felt all my life like I had this terrible, painful gender dysphoria that basically just debilitated me, and I wasn't able to function because the depression was so bad.
It's just that, I spent a lot of years, because of trauma, super dissociative. My dissociations were different. It wasn't like I became these other people, but I do have these other people in my head. Actually, part of what led me to transition is a bunch of these personalities are male. These facets of my personality are male or male presenting. And that sort of made me feel like, well, I'm everything, I'm not just a woman, I'm a man too. Almost like this non-binary type thing.
And to say that these young people can make the decision for themselves, and declaring counselling or psychotherapy or even consultation or discussions with parents irrelevant or an unnecessary burden just defies belief.
You can see the correlation, right? I got really depressed as my dysphoria got worse. I started testosterone and my self-harm got worse. Like, all of these steps I was taking towards transitioning were actually, I felt like they were making me better. Like, in the short term, these little things would make me euphoric. But in the long term, it was just getting worse.
Well, the Australian Psychological Society fails to discriminate subgroups of children and adolescents with gender dysphoria. And what we're mainly dealing with at the moment is a relatively new presentation called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it's had an incredible increase in the last 5 to 10 years, and in particular young female adolescents who had never shown any sign of gender dysphoria in early childhood suddenly declaring themselves transgender.
Experienced, and I still do experience dysphoria. All that's really changed is how I choose to label it. And a lot of my trans identity was connected with hating myself and seeing transition as this escape, this way out of my past and this way out of my body and this way out of just everything that I couldn't deal with on a day-to-day basis.
The fact that the Australian Psychological Society's submission and other statements that they've made recently fail to acknowledge this new subgroup of gender dysphoria serves to really muddy the waters about what are the underlying psychological issues affecting this subgroup of young people.
The fact that I was so obsessed with hormones, like I couldn't talk about anything else. This should have been some sort of red flag to someone somewhere. Like, I literally, the only thing I thought about was getting on hormones and, like, transitioning. That was it. Like, that was it. Like, you couldn't have a conversation with me about something else. I don't want to be like that anymore. Like, there's definitely a problem with, like, the way my brain, like, looks at things. But it's called my personality. So, like, that's it. Like, there's nothing else. I don't know. Like, how did that not raise questions for people? Like my parents, like, this is a problem, not something that should be, like, given into. But I've kind of always gotten what I want. So, like,
and in fact, the children that I've been treating, and the adolescents in particular, I view this rapid onset gender dysphoria as a problem of core identity.
And I would say that my whole life, probably just because I'm quite a sensitive person and because I'm a girl and we're taught to fixate on how we look, I would have a predisposition to getting body dysmorphia.
It's not a problem of gender identity. It's an issue where the young person is struggling to find their core identity. It is a psychological issue and not an issue that can be repaired or corrected with cross-sex hormones and mutilating surgery.
Nobody in the medical or psychological field ever tried to dissuade me to offer other options, to really do anything to stop me besides tell me I should wait until I was 18. This is what Serrano was talking about when they discussed the medical system and how it shouldn't be gate-kept. I want to ask you, how many other medical conditions are there where you can walk into the doctor's office, tell them you have a certain condition which has no objective test, which can be caused by trauma or mental health issues or societal factors, and just receive life-altering medications on your say-so? Does that sound like gatekeeping?
Because I feel like by encouraging minors to say, like, I'm in the wrong body, we're starting with a harmful mentality that's not going to go anywhere good. By that point, I had already convinced myself that I was a man trapped in a woman's body, as it were. So I don't know if there's much I could have said that would have been like, hey, you're not actually trapped in your body. Your body is your own for a reason. You were born in that body. Here's what I would say. I'd be a little bit harsh. And this probably wouldn't get the point across to her, but I would say, you were born a woman, and you're going to die a woman, no matter how many hormones you take, no matter how many surgeries you have. That doesn't change who you are. I just think saying that you can be a man in a woman's body is just wrong. Like, why would you tell a minor that you can just change your body? By encouraging minors to say, like, I'm in the wrong body, we're starting with a harmful mentality that's not going to go anywhere good.
Jump to the conclusion that these young people are transgender and that mutilating surgery that's irreversible is going to resolve all of the issues that are current in that young person's life.
I wanted to find ways of dealing with my gender issues that aren't medically transitioning, and those ways weren't presented to me. The only solution that was presented was chopping your breasts off, injecting yourself with hormones, and becoming a man.
And isn't that exactly then, Ed, what we're talking about? The concerns that you're going to take these kind of kids and you're going to fast track them, not require them to sit down with a therapist or not even encourage it. Try to bypass that, or if they do sit down with a therapist, tell the therapist that you're going to lose your license or end up in jail or sued, spending a lot of money, or even a pastor. If these kids rethink this, it goes on. There's a lot of different detransitioners that I interspersed in that video, again, called Understanding the Trans Movement, where these detransitioners basically said, why didn't anybody ask? If I'd had somebody just ask some questions, such as, what do you think this is about?
You shouldn't always, if you go to a therapist and they tell you that, if you just instantly say that, hey, I think I'm trans, and they affirm you and they don't ask any questions whatsoever and they automatically just want to prescribe you prescriptions for hormone therapy, you need to realize that is probably a very big red flag, and that therapist does not care about you. They only care about a statistic and making money off of you. All of these surgeons, the people who do top and bottom surgery, they do not care about you. They want to make money off of you. And you need to seriously start to take a step back and actually consider for yourself if this is the right decision for you. All these people who state that there's no detransitioners, there is. It's just people don't want us to speak up. They don't want us to tell you that it might not work, because then it's going to hurt their numbers. It's going to hurt their income. And all these people who make all this money off of you won't be making as much money if people start to actually think for themselves and think that this is not the right solution for them and that there might be other issues going on, like there was for me. I was not actually trans. I had a bunch of other issues going on up here.
And the one thing that is without exception of all the detransitioners, and again, we just saw 3 or 4 of them, but I've looked at hundreds of these videos produced by these detransitioners, and without exception, I haven't seen one that has not referenced sexual abuse.
And then my dad, I don't want to necessarily say everything that he was, because I haven't been open about that with anyone on camera or even in real life yet. But he was, a really bad person, a really dark, damaged person that passed a lot of his darkness into me. So,
was that just in his energy, or was he acting out on that?
Actions.
He was abusive physically?
Yeah, I don't want to necessarily say exactly what form of abuse, but the kind that will give you trauma.
Right.
For sure. And maybe come up in repressed memories when you're 30, which I learned is actually very common.
Repressed memories?
Well, that it can happen that late.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Yeah, I never knew that, There's a lot of damage that I'm realizing is there, so now I'm fixing it.
That your father's abusive towards you. Because the father is a very powerful figure in our lives as an archetype. And if we're being abused by the father and he's not there for us, creating safety, that's really the primary job of the father. Do you have any sense of the meaning you made of that?
No, again, it's kind of twofold the answer.
He let you down.
Oh, for sure. Worse than that, failure, flop, monster, evil. But, a lot of the actions on his part were actually buried deep down in my psyche. So they didn't start coming up until about 29, 30. So in one way, I didn't make any sense of it. But then also, what's really fascinating about that is my body always knew that he was a demon. Not in the literal sense, but bad for me to be around, dark, like I said. Because I remember, the only real memories I have of him are always hating him, but not knowing why.
You always hated him.
Yeah, he'd walk in the room and I would tell him, like, you know, get the fuck away from me for no reason, completely unwarranted. And in fact, the last thing I ever said to him, this is going to sound crazy, is I hope you get cancer and fucking die, you fucking cunt. I was like 17 or 18. And it was triggered by him asking me to take the trash out. And I just said that from the top of the stairs. And he looked at me with basically a knowledge that he deserved it. Like, he didn't even fight back, which was interesting.
He knew.
I think, I believe. And then this is actually the crazy part. 2 weeks later, he got cancer and died. Out of nowhere, full body cancer. So I don't know what that means, but I said that to say that I never had a logical, concrete reason as a kid to hate him, but I always knew I did.
Well, you had logical, concrete reasons to hate him. Did you not?
But the repressed memories, I didn't actually growing up remember what he had done to me specifically. And it's a very specific thing he did. So I just always still felt the energy of what that action was. And it made me hate him forever. And he was very deserving of it. So
interesting. What you know, he did something to you that was dark and scary and painful,
for sure.
And you now live with that, and you're becoming aware that that's inside you, the impact of that, and it's unresolved, and it's having an impact on your life today. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's had a huge impact now that I have more clarity on the entirety of my life. But it was only once those memories came up again that I could kind of see that, oh, that's why I do that. That's why my brain works like that. That's why I have this view of this thing that is whatever.
Yeah, pretty standard. Yeah. It's interesting to see that England has pulled back from going ahead with conversion therapy. And of course, the Tavistock clinic has been shut down. But then we also have Sweden and we have Belgium, who are really leading all this sort of stuff, have also pulled back dramatically. And then you have countries like Australia and America and Canada going in the other direction. And you've got to say, what's going on, you know?
Gender reaffirming surgery. Here's a honest update. Do I regret it? Short answer is yes. Don't get me wrong, I got it done twice. It looks Barbie. Why do I regret it? Well, because I will never be able to live a normal life. After the surgery, you have to start dilating to keep the space they gave you. You start from doing it 4 times a day to once a week for the rest of your life. I was fine with that. See, the problem is I had major complications, and now for some reason I need to do it every single day. Now, obviously, I've had relations, and girls, we all know guys don't know what to do. So it's not really worth it to me. The problem is I cannot stop. If I stop, it's going to close up and create a bubble, and that bubble could literally create an infection that could... The two options here are I dilate for the rest of my life, or I get it removed surgically. Surgery goes for $70,000, and I don't want to go through that again, so I guess I'm dilating.
Thank you very much, Adia, for sharing your story, especially during a month where that's what we should be doing.
What's going to happen to the kids and the youth? And there's so many, there's so many people who regret this. There's more and more and more coming out, and younger too, on puberty blockers, that been on puberty blockers. And, you know, I read one that, you know, I think he went on puberty blockers at 16, and now he's like 20 or 21, and he is like suicidal because his penis won't grow anymore. Like, it does damage.
I had a few complications, bleedings, infections.
I've had complications, and I've had a hard time.
We're like bawling my eyes out saying, like, what did I do?
If I had known about the irreversible physical damage I caused to my body, then I would have never done any of this.
I appreciate that these folks have the courage to go and actually speak about what they're essentially been asked not to speak about. When you have the physical surgery, you don't actually resolve the mental issue. And when you have these physical surgeries, you actually compile yet another set of things to deal with. It's really a sad thing. And I really do appreciate that these folks are warning people, because I think young kids who are on TikTok and on our social media are receiving these ads from medical predators who are telling them that once they castrate themselves. Once they remove their breast, they're just going to be so happy and they're going to feel comfortable in their bodies, and the whole thing will just be euphoric for them. And it is simply not true. It is a lie.
I don't think that teenagers can make informed consent decisions to be able to transition. I also don't think that young adults have the full capacity to make that decision either. I don't think that until your brain is fully developed, I would say around 20 or a little bit later for some people, is when that development really kicks into adulthood. I didn't understand the long-term ramifications of what I was doing until I was 20. I stopped at 19, but I didn't consider how that was going to affect the rest of my life, really, until I was 20. And I started processing it. And that's when I started my YouTube channel. The fact that people think that 12-year-olds know, I don't even know how to talk to those people. And if that's you, thanks for listening, but I don't think I could have a conversation with you.
Cool, and I am a detransitioner. Another way to put that would be, I used to believe that I was born in the wrong body, and the adults in my life whom I trusted affirmed my belief, and this caused me lifelong, irreversible harm. I speak to you today as a victim of one of the biggest medical scandals in the history of the United States of America. I speak to you in the hope that you will have the courage to bring the scandal to an end and ensure that other vulnerable teenagers, children, and young adults don't go through what I went through. Before I was able to legally drive, I had a huge part of my future womanhood taken from me. I will never be able to breastfeed. I struggle to look at myself in the mirror at times. I still struggle to this day with sexual dysfunction. And I have massive scars across my chest. And the skin grafts that they took of my nipples are weeping fluid today. And they were grafted into a more masculine positioning, they said.
It makes me so angry. And what we're gonna get is a generation that's screwed up. That are screwed up in like 10, 15 years. Wait, not even. I think it's accelerating quite quickly. When we get 30, 40-year-olds that are going to be like, what the did I do when I was 16 or whatever, like, and you can't go back. You can't go back.
After surgery, my grades in school plummeted. Everything that I went through did nothing to address my underlying mental health issues that I had. And my doctors, with their theories on gender, thought that all my problems would go away as soon as I was surgically transformed into something that vaguely resembled a boy. Their theories were wrong. The drugs and surgeries changed my body, but they did not and could not change the basic reality that I am and forever will be a female. When my specialist first told my parents that they could have a dead daughter or a live transgender son, I wasn't suicidal. I was a happy child who struggled because she was different. However, at 16, after my surgery, I did become suicidal. I'm doing better now, but my parents almost got the dead daughter promised to them by my doctors. My doctors had almost created the very nightmare they said they were trying to avoid. So what message do I want to bring to American teenagers and their families? I didn't need to be lied to. I needed compassion. I needed to be loved. I needed to be given therapy to help me work through my issues, not affirm to my delusion that by transforming into a boy, it would solve all my problems. We need to stop telling 12-year-olds that they were born wrong, that they are right to reject their own bodies and feel uncomfortable with their own skin. We need to stop telling children that puberty is an option, that they can choose what kind of puberty they will go through, just so they can choose what clothes to wear or what music to listen to. Puberty is a rite of passage to adulthood, not a disease to be mitigated.
I'm sad for myself, of course. Not in a victim kind of way, but in like, this process of mourning who I was is touch and go. So But I'm sad for humanity and the children and what's gonna happen. When they're screwed up, we're gonna see what's gonna happen. And I really, really hope that all these professionals get their friggin' karma, because I know that some of them don't realize and some of them might be brainwashed and whatever, but some of them know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. Cash cow.
Today, I should be at home with my family celebrating my 19th birthday. And instead, I'm making a desperate plea to my elected representatives. Learn the lessons from other medical scandals like the opioid crisis. To recognize that doctors are human too, and sometimes they are wrong. My childhood was ruined along with thousands of detransitioners that I know through our networks. This needs to stop. You alone can stop it. Enough children have already been victimized by this barbaric pseudoscience. Please let me be your final warning. Thank you.
A Wall Street Journal op-ed today reading the truth about puberty blockers. And the more digging we did, the more disturbing the truth was. The effects, very serious and permanent.
But turns out the FDA hasn't even approved puberty blockers to transition kids. So what do hospitals keep pushing so hard for these drugs in kids?
Could it be because they're reeling in loads of loot from these procedures? You bring in a kid and start the transition. That is a patient for life, a 7-figure patient. According to Grandview Research, in 2021, the U.S. transition market size was about $1.9 billion. In 2030, it's expected to reach $6 billion.
Joining us now to talk about it is Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, Do No Harm Chairman and former Associate Dean at the University of Pennsylvania. Doctor, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Listen, what the hell is going on here? Why hospitals are pushing so hard to have kids take drugs that have lifetime effects, long-term effects, and it's not even approved by the FDA?
Yes, well, it's very good to be with you. Of course, there are a lot of drugs that aren't approved by the FDA and are widely used. But in this particular instance, I think what you're seeing is this whole ideology about gender affirmation, so-called gender affirmation, coming to reality. And the idea here is to prevent children from going through puberty. By doing so, the argument is made, this gives them a chance to consider whether they want to go on hormones that are then going to change their secondary sexual characteristics and ultimately for surgery. The problem here is, more than the fact that it's not FDA approved, is the fact that over 95% of children who start these puberty blockers end up on the hormones. And the hormones, as well as the puberty blockers, do produce irreversible long-term changes. Now, the argument that puberty blockers are completely reversible is the essence of Mr. Posner's article, and the point is they're not completely reversible. They have been associated with some really severe side effects, such as changes in bone function, particularly, and also some even more troubling ones, such as evidence of some swelling of the brain. There have been some changes that have been observed about the cognitive function of children that are put on these drugs. The benefit for the children, supposedly, is that they will never go through puberty and then will be able to have a physical appearance that more closely follows the gender that they're trying to transform into. But the downside is twofold. One is that, as we said, the drugs have long-term effects. And secondly, if these children weren't put through this whole medicalization of gender transformation, we know from multiple studies that they will go on to lead perfectly happy lives. They may be gay, they may be bisexual, or they may be heterosexual. But failing to allow them to go through puberty is actually preventing normal development of them as human beings.
And Doctor, here in the United States, there are up to 19 states that have banned in some way these restricted gender affirming care, and that's the way it's referred to. But the trans movement has made it a political issue here in the United States. No debate, no dissent, the science is settled. That's not the case. If you look overseas, Finland has cut back on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to minors. Sweden, Norway, Britain's National Health Service shut the country's largest youth gender clinic because there were people who were not doctors, not scientists, pushing children into this, quote, gender affirming care who did not have gender dysphoria, who were autistic or even mentally ill. Some of the stories are really quite frightening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The experience in Europe has really been a sort of an eye-opening event because these are countries that have had longer experiences than in the United States with this so-called treatment, and the ones you mentioned have come to that conclusion that in fact there's evidence that they're doing more harm than good. And again, I think the reason is because they're taking individuals who would go through puberty and be perfectly normal individuals, and they're turning them into individuals who require these medications, as you said in the beginning, for the rest of their lives, including surgery that can be quite mutilating. You know, we work closely with a young woman named Chloe Cole, who you may have heard of. She is a young woman who, at age 15, had her breast removed, and now she's a beautiful 19-year-old woman who goes around the country telling individuals, telling physicians, telling legislators how this has really basically ruined her reproductive life and maybe her life in general. And she felt like she was not given an informed consent. And I think this is one of the biggest issues for your listeners, is that these children are not able to give informed consent.
Right. Dr. Goldfarb, great to see you. Please come back very soon. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Doc.
If you look at the testimonies that we have in the study, and you also look at on the site, on the website, we also have a pile of testimonies, a bit over 30. It's quite interesting to read those people's stories as to where or how they got into the position of being into those lifestyles. And many of them say why they weren't happy and why they wanted to be out. And it just shows that people do leave the lifestyle and should have that right. Why should these kids that you just showed there be stuck and not be able to get help to sort their lives out?
And that's what every one of them. That's what every one of them is saying. Ed, let's talk about the aftermath of this. Now, in retrospect, there is information on your site. Remind people where they can access this information.
Yeah, that's Pt.2 is where the study is. And our stopsafeschools.com has Diana Kenny, as you just saw, and a number of other professionals. There's articles and videos on there about the whole gender dysphoria area. And I think what you said before, John, is very true. What all this is about the transgender movement. They're using the ex-LGBT people, they're using the LGBT community and supposed conversion therapy abuses as an excuse to push this legislation through to enforce the transgender movement. And that's very much what all this is about at the moment.
Let's talk about this retrospective look then. Tell the viewers, when they access this, what information is contained in this resource.
Okay, so what you're looking at there is a presentation.
We'll make this one available.
You may or may not be aware that your current state government is aiming to ban all practices that come under the name conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is a newly created term that encapsulates so many practices, from harmful practices that we do not condone and are simply not practiced anymore, but also helpful forms of assistance that we will discuss shortly. Now, we do acknowledge that there are people who identify as LGBT and are content with this, but there are also people who have same-sex attraction or gender confusion and wish to not live with these feelings. And so under conversion therapy legislation, any form of help for these people that does not align with the LGBT ideology will be made illegal and unavailable. If governments continue to legislate such restrictions that deny people like me and many others the help that we pursued, then it fails to bring a balanced perspective to this parliamentary debate. In 2020, we set up a project to share this other side of the story that many continue to ignore. This book details the findings of this project and was produced by academics and experts in this field. I present to you the Free to Change study, research and reality of 78 former LGBT people. The Free to Change website was the platform we used to facilitate this project. People who had experienced unwanted same-sex attraction and people who had detransitioned came to our website to tell us about their lives. A survey was required of all participants, which gave us the data that we're about to present. In addition, some participants shared their stories via video.
Yeah, so that just basically talks about conversion therapy in Australia, what the laws are, how they impact people, what conversion therapy is considered to be or not to be, who can help who with what. In other words, if you want to be gay, then you can get assistance. If you decide you don't want to be, well, then there's no assistance, and any assistance that might be given is then the people are charged and brought before the courts. And so, as you pointed out before, very much psychologists, psychiatrists, religious leaders, and parents as well get picked up in this legislation. Absolutely. And look, it comes down to some people putting their hand up and being prepared to be dragged before the courts and to fight this. That's the only way we're going to win this, because if we keep putting our heads in the sand and pretending it's going to go away, it's not. And it's the only way is to ultimately is to fight in the courts. But that means the rest of the community needs to support parents who do this sort of thing.
Right, and that's
and professionals. Sorry.
No, that's why I'm appreciative. Again, freetochange.org. Here's right there. Sorry. A very four-color booklet, and it is based on the research. And this is the resource that people can give their lawmakers, their school board members, anybody that needs proof that people can change. They need to be able to be free to change and need to be able to sit down with the people of their own choosing, the therapists or the pastors, to process what likely is trauma-based so that they can make a decision, an informed decision in their best interest, so that we don't continue to have these young people that have regret, and they're called detransitioners. Right now, 50,000 of them on that Reddit site, and that we're not helping kids. And this is not just a minor thing. We're talking about medicalization, sterilization, and amputation of body parts. That's a fairly radical thing to do to troubled kids. Brad, it's just, this whole thing is just unbelievable. Ed, thank you for being just a tremendous resource for us and for spearheading that study.
And thank you guys for your time and for all the work you do. John, for contributing to the study. It was greatly appreciated. And Brad, for what you do in putting this into the air.
Thank you very much to both of you for being here today. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement. Remember, you can find us on BitChute. We're also on YouTube, and you can find us at our website, our home, at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. On behalf of John Euler and Ed Sparrius, I'm Brad Wilder, saying thank you very much for joining us today. Remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight, and it's time to make it count. I'll see you soon.